internet safety, because in my city of Saskatoon, we have a whole department at the city of Saskatoon Police actually designated looking for perpetrators that are online.
You had mentioned sexual offenders being released with mere warnings. Can you talk a bit about that and how often that occurs?
What unique harms, I guess, arise when the sexual abuse or grooming or exploitation takes place online versus in person?
At some point, I think we need to talk about this as a highly addictive thing in the same way that we talk about cigarettes. We regulate cigarettes. We regulate their advertisements to kids. We regulate how people interact with them, how they're sold, all those kind of things.
I know that you had mentioned, I believe, that some children's influencers can make upwards of $30 million. Can you name, say, 5 or 6 of the top influencers in Canada?
How this works in really simplistic terms, because I think we have members of the Canadian public who are just unaware of the fact that gaming platforms and social media platforms can be used in this way, and the danger that is actually posed to young people.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Our first meeting to do with this study has to do with the impact of social media, and in particular influencers on social media, on those under the age of 18.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Polson-Holman, and thank you to Professor Clark for being here. I guess my first question, and I will go to the Little Warriors. Wanda, I think the public is seeing increased occurrences, and this is a word that we've talked a lot here in the House of Commons this week, exploitation, and we're seeing it at all levels, but maybe can you give us some stats on children? You had 4 or 5 points that you did make, but the exploitation of children online, do you have any of the stats that maybe you could share with us here today?
Thank you for the question, and I certainly do. I'm also happy to provide more statistics afterwards. Some of the recent statistics that I'm aware of is that with regard to specifically sextortion of children and youth, since 2020, there's been an 80% increase in the reporting of sextortion cases, and victim demographics are most often youth aged 12 to 17. In addition, we also know that CyberTip, for example, has reported a 150% increase with regard to sextortion and online luring between June 2022 and August 2023, and those are the most recent statistics that I'm aware of.
Now, you also mentioned there's gaps in legislation, and I would like you to talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind. We've talked about it a little bit here in Parliament, but you brought it up, and you talked about the gaps in legislation, mainly the sentencing gaps that we've seen over the last number of years. So just bring us up to date what you are seeing in the Edmonton area, Alberta area, and the sentencing gaps that, that could be the job of parliamentarians, when we do go through some legislation.
Well, I know that there have been ongoing issues that have been brought up with regard to the Online Harms Act, and understand that the reason that we're coming together is to explore some pieces related to that. We know that there's similar things that are needed to limit the amount of child sex exploitation. We need some regulations to support schools as well as parents in their understanding, as well as understanding across communities. We know that people, from our perspective at Little Warriors have not been held accountable in the way that they need to. The deterrence is very minimal at this point. We have children who come to us for child sexual abuse treatment as a result of being harmed online and sexually abused and exploited. And many times their offenders and perpetrators are released without serving any time or having any consequences that relate specifically to the crime. And what I mean by that is that the children and teens come to us and are requiring intensive supports and treatment for what has happened to them. And very often their perpetrators are released into the public, sometimes with notifications, and they are reoffending. And we've had several situations at Little Warriors where this has happened, and there is just not enough deterrence in place for them to stop what they're doing. And it's very difficult to continue to follow offenders and perpetrators online as a result of the ongoing changes that are happening and ways that they're doing it through gaming platforms and social media platforms for children as young as 7 or 8 years old.
I come from Saskatchewan. There isn't a week that goes by when we hear through, whether it's city police in Saskatoon, Regina, Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, other locations, or the RCMP, where they have convicted somebody, and then we never hear what happens after the conviction. And it was interesting to hear when you were talking about it, because those that have been exploited, what recommendations would you give this committee then about internet safety? Because in my city of Saskatoon, we have a whole department at the city of Saskatoon Police actually designated looking for perpetrators that are online.
Well, I think it's a really important question. I think that in terms of recommendations of safety, I think the public needs to understand exactly what are the numbers and what is happening and the amount of online offenders that are actually present that cross international borders and have very little deterrence as well to reach out to children. In Edmonton, we had a very unfortunate case that I'm sure everyone's aware of that crossed into the United States, and unfortunately that particular child and her family have forever been changed, and fortunately the offender was charged in the United States, but we've had other children where their offenders come and are in Canada and are released very early or released and have fled the country, and had other situations where there's very little ability to follow up on their sentencing. So that's very important, as well as supporting children and families to understand the complexities and changes that are happening with regard to safety measures online.
Thank you, Dr. Poulsen-Holman.
Growing up, I too was quite interested in the YouTube space, and my father at the time, and to this day, was very reluctant at the idea of seeing me join or engage in YouTube in any way, shape, or form. And in hindsight, it made perfect sense. I'm not particularly talented. I'm not a great musician in any way, shape, or form. But it did ultimately stand to benefit me significantly. In your view, who is currently benefiting from this gap? And who should be held accountable for protecting children from being commercialized online? And what policy mechanisms do you think might help us do that?
So the number one beneficiary in this space are the platforms. There's no halfway about it. These are massive, massive companies making billions in revenue, specifically in the advertising from child content and the advertising to children. The fact that there is no control over this is a giant mistake. The fact that we've been asking them to police themselves is a massive mistake, and it is not in anybody's best interest to do so. Beyond that, I mean, the primary beneficiary financially is the parents. And so if you are beneath the age of 12, you cannot have a YouTube account. You cannot have a TikTok account. Your point about age verifications is taken. But if you want to get paid from those things, you certainly can't get paid through PayPal or the other mechanisms at that age. So the kids are employees of their parents. And anything that's happening to them as a result of that is because their parents are putting them in that position to be their employees. And so the protections ultimately should fall on the parents, or as a proxy, us as a society.
That same article states that each kid-fluencing venture is a privately owned enterprise and the employees in question are minors. Given these indicators, how do you believe platforms and regulators distinguish between legitimate participation in social media and ventures that are exploitative, and what concrete step do you believe we can do to prevent children from being put in those situations? I recall a couple weeks ago we had Meta here, and Meta made reference to the idea of the app stores taking on that burden of essentially ensuring age verification. Do you believe that might be a venue to be explored?
Well, the age verification component, is valuable when it talks about downloading the app and who's watching social media. But when it comes to putting content on social media, basically we effectively punt this to the parents. We say, oh, well, if the parents are okay with this video, with this production, because they're the ones who have to own the account, that's effectively our responsibility. So, honestly, I don't think age verification is going to really help us here beyond a point. That ultimately we have a responsibility to say that there's harm being done, and that harm is being done irrespective of the de facto age, and that people are profiting from that, and that is a broader, wider, more societal problem.
I wanted to kind of bring this home to talk about a real-world story. I noticed that on your website you talk about the case of Michelle, a mother whose story reminds us of why Little Warriors was created. Can you tell us a bit about Michelle's story and the story she shared about her daughter and how her daughter fell victim?
Thank you, Mr. Diot. I appreciate your kind words. I certainly can say a little bit more about the child and family that were impacted. The child was treated at Little Warriors in our intensive episodic treatment center, and the reason that she came to us is that there was an online predator, and the parents of the child, who at the time was somewhere around 12 years of age. The parents were very much involved in this child's life, very much involved in setting controls and checking and supporting their child's digital literacy. The issue actually came when the child was at school and was able to access social media platforms where the offender took advantage of safety that wasn't in place and continued to reach out, came to Edmonton not once but twice and met her at her school, and at that point had taken her across the border in the United States and had significantly sexually assaulted and raped her. So, this unfortunately is a very significant example of what can happen and what the harms are. But unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. We've had numerous other situations of boys and girls under the age of 18 who have had very similar situations and have been assaulted as a result and have been manipulated in various ways. So it is a problem that definitely needs to be addressed, and we can't settle for what currently is in place.
Thanks for that. And you had mentioned sexual offenders being released with mere warnings. Can you talk a bit about that and how often that occurs?
Well, unfortunately, we have situations, Mr. Diot, you would be also familiar with the case. There was an offender who was found who was reported at a daycare just outside of Edmonton and had access to children under the age of 5 at a preschool or a daycare setting. And he was awaiting trial and actually fled the country. And since that time, we are aware that there have been other children who, again, ages 4, 5, 6 years old, who unfortunately have experienced the abuse that he put upon them in the daycare. We've had numerous situations where children and teens who are awaiting treatment and can't get into treatment have their offenders released because there's not enough information or not enough sentencing, or that they've served a short period of time and are released and have reoffended again.
So what would you like to see done in that regard? What are some immediate steps that could be taken there?
Well, it's not my area of expertise to say, but certainly I think we need to be looking at our sentencing and perhaps having minimum and mandatory minimums, as well as looking at the process in which and the speed to which we support vulnerable children and youth and their families to report sexual abuse.
And that you would not be a fan of the recent Supreme Court decision against mandatory minimums for child pornography.
I know it's a complex issue, and I understand some of the rationale behind that, but from the perspective of supporting vulnerable children and youth, my position is always to ensure that our focus is on supporting children and youth, and ensuring that they're safe, and that offenders should be serving their sentences and be treated with very significant penalties for their actions.
Is there a possibility to address the actual addictiveness of the algorithm? I mean, of course, the platforms aren't going to be interested in that, and maybe that's overstepping, but at some point, I think we need to talk about this as a highly addictive thing in the same way that we talk about cigarettes. We regulate cigarettes. We regulate their advertisements to kids. We regulate how people interact with them, how they're sold, all those kind of things.
So this is a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I actually think I want to weigh in on a little bit on this, is that there is a privacy issue here. You are a unique individual to YouTube or to Instagram. They know you. They know what you like. They know what you want. They know what you've watched before. They have a file on you somewhere. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to capture personal usage data on us so that they can target us. I don't know our ability to regulate this, and given that chances are this data does not exist in Canada, it probably is in some vault somewhere in the States or in Iceland or wherever. But the simple fact is they are collecting information on you. They are using it to figure out who you are, what you like, and what you want. I swear I think YouTube knows me better than my wife does, and we've been married for 10 years, and she knows me very well, but she can't tell you what I want to watch on YouTube the way YouTube can. So that's a frightening thing for me. And so I wonder about that degree of privacy and the platform's ability to know us so well.
I would also just add something that you've brought forward with regard to the addictiveness and brain development. We know that children and teens, that our brains are not fully developed until well into their 20s. And so we have seen the effects of the addictiveness of the algorithms, of the changes with regard to socialization and interests for even infants who are given iPads and other devices. And we know that the reward center of the brain is completely connected with those algorithms. And so we are very clear from a neurodevelopmental perspective that this kind of thing is actually changing the brains and therefore changing the trajectory of our children's development.
At this point in time, I'm going to take 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll continue from there. My first question is for you, Dr. Polson-Holman. Sorry. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit further, just in terms of maybe we'll start here. Actually, on your website, you state that more than 95% of child sexual abuse cases in Canada go unreported, and I'm just curious as to why that number is so high.
Well, there's several reasons why the number is so high. First and foremost is that many children and teens who are sexually abused, this is happening with offenders who are very well known to them, family members, other people within their social circles that are offending against them. And so over time, they and or their caregivers have been manipulated and groomed, either in person or online. And oftentimes, by the time that the offense takes place, or offenses oftentimes takes place, is there's been a lengthy period of time that they've been involved with certain activities and been exploited, and so they begin to feel that they are somehow partially to blame, or that there's embarrassment or shame. Oftentimes, offenders will manipulate them and tell them that they will be hurt or their family will be hurt. So there's many reasons. I recently read a study, not a Canadian study, but that shared that adults, as child sexual abuse survivors, their first time sharing their offense is actually in their 50s. So I don't have Canadian stats on that, but there's many reasons why that number is as high as it is.
Thank you for your reflections on that. I'm curious if you can reflect maybe a little bit more on what are the harms, what unique harms, I guess, arise when the sexual abuse or grooming or exploitation takes place online versus in person?
I think there's many of the same harms. Obviously, significant impacts for safety, significant impacts to mental health and wellness, as we've talked about. I think the difference is that when there are things going on online, we don't know the extent to which this is happening, and it crosses borders. It doesn't just stay in the home or the community, but it can be transitioned halfway across the world, and the images are shared, and no one would know that. So, while there's similarities, and I don't think that one is better or worse or, less disruptive or less disturbing, I think that the issue is really with regard to how far reaching it is.
Doctor, in your time with us today, if there was one thing that you wanted us to take away from our time with you, given your experience over many years, probably decades, of working with children in these vulnerable situations, what would be the thing that you would want us to take away?
I think understanding the level of concern. Oftentimes people think that this happens to other people or other people's children. This is happening. I guarantee that once you start talking about this and removing the barriers for communication and discussion around this, that the prevalence is very, very high. We know that 1 in 4 children, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys under the age of 18 is sexually abused in some way, and we know that 95% isn't reported. So when we talk about the numbers, it's a very significant number, and we need to be taking it seriously and recognizing that this isn't about someone else's child. This is about all of our children, all of our teens, and within all of our families and communities.
Sorry. Thank you very much for those reflections. Very much appreciated. A quick question to you, Mr. Clark. Just curious, you said that $11 billion is earned in ad revenue in the United States of America, but I'm just curious if you have any stats for Canada.
Unfortunately, I don't. I believe that was actually the total earnings of the platform, so that would include Canada as well. But I don't know what the Canadian ad revenue is for children, for media consumed by children under the age of 18.
The idea of radicalization and polarization. Again, because of the nature of the algorithm reacting, it seeks reaction, strong reaction, both negative and positive. A moderate position that doesn't get anybody super angry or super happy doesn't have much of a life online. So I guess what I wonder about also is the effect on young people of public discourse, civil public discourse, being able to disagree. That we're quite good at it here in this room, I think, which is a very important thing for polarization in the future of our democracy in our country. And I do worry about this effect of the algorithm on young people's ability to have civil discourse. Because if, as you're just looking through the comments, but even the algorithm itself, the way it behaves and reacts, it makes me fearful of these things. How can we make people aware of these things? How can we address these issues so people understand that that discourse in person looks very different? I hope.
We could all learn from hockey a little bit here. You have a game where people are checking each other and slashing each other and shooting pucks at each other's heads. And at the end of the game, you go up to each other and you shake each other's hands. You have some high fives. And, I think we have to learn to have intellectual battles the same way we have physical battles and know that it's not personal. So if we talk about the role of schools and the role of parents, I think engaging kids in a way that allows them to learn how to have arguments, and it's not about you, it's about the ideas, and don't take everything so personally and just and have free-flowing progressive ideas. It'd be great. I love that. I mean, that's what being an academic is all about, and that's what we try and preach in academia. So if we could figure out how to teach our kids to do that, that would be amazing.
Before I go to Dr. Poulsen-Holman, the challenge is, of course, in a hockey game, you are in the room with the person and there's a human being on the other side. Right? In a university class, there's a human being that you sense has feelings and dignity.
Yes.
Online, you don't have that.
Yeah.
Right? There's a facelessness to it, and that is the danger of this. Just in terms of it becoming the norm of behavior, how do you address that where they're not in the same room, where they're not seeing each other at the end of the game?
That's a great question. I don't know if you can address it because the whole value in the internet for some people is the anonymity. The fact that they are not personally held account by the same rules of society that we have face-to-face. In fact, it's one of the reasons why some kids are so comfortable being online, because this is hard. This is risky. This is live in-person judgment. Whereas online, you can say anything, you can be anything, you can do anything, and tomorrow is a fresh new day.
Holman, do you have anything to add, please?
I would agree fully, and I would say from the perspective of offenders and perpetrators who are specifically looking to befriend children and teens, and sometimes even like single parents, for example. You can present in any way you want online. You're not, having that discussion in person. One of the things that we teach at Little Warriors in our Be Brave Bridge program, which is an online psychoeducational component of our program, is that we teach parents or caregivers to really have discussions about things. Issues can't be black and white, or parents can't just control everything, because then specifically teens go out of their way to try to access things that their parents say, no, you can't do this. So the issue is partially that, but partially it's also giving parents the tools to be able to have the very important conversations about safety and about risk and about why they're concerned, so that there can be the discord between them.
I know that you had mentioned, I believe, that some children's influencers can make upwards of $30 million. Can you name, say, 5 or 6 of the top influencers in Canada?
That's a much harder thing to do. It seems like all the really big money influencers are in the United States or in Europe or in Asia. I honestly don't know of any Canadian kids, I should say, who are in that strata of income. But I also would add to that, the $30 million is what they earn from the platforms. It's not what they earn from advertising revenue and other forms of monetization that they do.
What would be some that are fairly popular right across the board? Obviously, it's a global village, so can you name like 5 or 6? Because I wouldn't know who they are.
So the biggest YouTuber in the world is a channel called Mr. Beast. And he has transformed the space. He is the first YouTube billionaire. He has product marketing. He now has a Netflix series. The most powerful kid is a kid named Ryan Kaji. He's the one who is the first person to break the $30 million a year level as a child. He started at the age of 6. He is now, I believe he's 15, and he's kind of phased out of kidfluencing, but his parents, who own the channel, obviously, have passed it on to his younger brother and sister, and so they're the ones who are making the money for the family, and they have a company with 50 employees. They have cameramen, they have sound people, they have writers, they have editors, etc. And so it is a massive organization. So those are two of the really big ones that I think are worth noting. But honestly, I have a list in my paper that I'm happy to send you that includes all of the top 1,000 influencers on YouTube, and it's everything from something that's utterly mundane to stuff that is radicalized and very political, and they all have tremendous followings, and they have a tremendous ability to change and affect behaviors.
So, I guess one thing, if parents were watching this committee, they'd probably be fairly alarmed by just how pervasive it is. And I guess the big question they would be asking, like, what can I do? Parents, as you rightly noted, are the best keepers of their children. We don't want governments telling parents what to do with their children, obviously. What would you give for advice to parents to help them deal with this phenomenon?
So the classic thing which was introduced like 20 years ago is just as true today. Make online activities communal, right? So if you're using your iPad, you have to be in the living room and where we can all see what you're doing. If you're, or the family computer, something. The point being is, limit the ability to do this in your room alone without being able to watch it. That gets progressively harder the older the kids get, right? You have privacy issues. You want the kids to develop their own morals and right and wrong. But at least with my young daughter, we basically say, yeah, you can be online, but we're going to watch what you're doing, and we're going to be there. And we hear something like, I don't like the way that person is talking. Change the channel. Watch something else. Do something else. Because honestly, without that, I don't know what we would do.
Is there anything else? That's a really good point, but is there anything else that's sort of top of mind?
I would also say limit the amount of individual access they have to social media. So, don't let them have a Facebook account. Don't let them have an Instagram account. Or at the very least, don't allow them to post. So that they can follow other people, they can watch other people, but their ability to put themselves out there is limited. Fundamentally, you have to think about online activity as a game of Russian roulette. Okay, the barrel can have millions and millions of slots and one bullet, but the more people do online and the more exposed they are and the more views they get, the number of slots start shrinking to the point where you are almost guaranteed that something bad is going to happen to you when you get into that realm of 100 million views. So, but everything is a risky behavior. Everything you do online is a risky behavior, and it's how risk tolerant you are. And I don't want kids under the age of 14 having to make decisions about risk. They're generally very bad about it.
Thank you. Good points.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Dr. Polson-Holman, when you testified in the Standing Committee on the Status of Women last year, you noted, and I quote, and pray that the number here is wrong, recent reports indicate that over the past 5 years, online sexual luring of Canadian children is up 815%. Is that accurate? And I leave this question open-ended. Could you speak to it a little, please?
It is accurate. I took my stats from specific areas. I can provide more information to this committee as well regarding similar stats as well as that. We certainly are seeing that. I think that the biggest change point that we've certainly recognized is during the pandemic, there were so many things that just completely opened up for children and youth as a result of being online and having access to devices for school. And it, for those reasons, it served a purpose. But since that time, I don't think any of the controls and any of the time spent has been pulled back. Even though children and teens are now in school, they're constantly on devices. I think schools that have taken the stance to not have children on their phones has certainly limited things like cyberbullying as well. And so there's numerous harms that continue to present themselves, and the problem is not going away. As mentioned with AI and other areas, there's just new things that are opening up for us to have to address. And so at some point we need to, have a stand and take a stand on creating some ways to address this. But it's going to be a work in progress because we know that things are constantly changing.
Well, folks, thank you. Thank you to all of the members. I will be taking the Conservative time slot for 5 minutes. I guess my question first goes to Ms. Polson-Holman. My question for you is, you talked a little bit about this in your opening remarks, but I'm hoping you can expand on it actually quite a bit, and that is the internet, often social media platforms and gaming platforms are used to lure and then groom and then eventually exploit young people. And you work with these individuals after these events have transpired, and of course they have a significant effect on them. But I would like, if you could, to actually just talk about how this works in really simplistic terms, because I think we have members of the Canadian public who are just unaware of the fact that gaming platforms and social media platforms can be used in this way, and the danger that is actually posed to young people.
Thank you for the question. I think that there's numerous ways that this happens online. We know that there's social platforms such as, Instagram, Snapchat, Roadblocks, other games where children, can be playing even in front of their parents in their living room, dining room. Parents can see it happening. They're plugged into headphones and they're having conversations with friends. They don't know that their friend, like I said, is actually who they are. They might have, certain photos of them. They can have conversations. Oftentimes it's not verbally, it's through different texts or instant messaging. And so what happens is that the grooming process, from the perspective of the children that we see at Little Warriors, happens immediately. Is that there's predators out there that are looking for vulnerable kids, and they start gaming, and it all seems very innocuous, but over time what happens is they start learning that they're in maybe a single parent household where there's not a lot of supervision, that a parent is working 2 jobs, or they're alone certain times, and then the child has a picture behind them of their school information, or they're wearing a hoodie or sweatshirt, and so those things can get very easily manipulated. And parents, we have parents who have been very involved in their children's lives and have checked their social media, have accounts that they can look in at any time, and they wouldn't necessarily see that it's an issue until there's different stages of the grooming process where they're meeting up, where they're sending images, where they're then manipulating children and teens because they've sent inappropriate inappropriate materials. And sometimes they're actually paying for different access to games, or like coins, for example, that they can improve their standing in certain games, and they can send that through the internet without anybody really knowing anything at all. So, this happens online, like I said, much more than parents are aware of. It's frightening to know the extent that this is happening and the ease to which it is happening. And as I've mentioned, unfortunately, it has ended very dramatically and very sadly, where children are being sexually exploited and abused.
So how does it transpire then? How does it, how does it go from sitting in your living room, your parents are aware of your conversations and what's transpiring, to being sexually abused? How does that happen?
Well, sometimes it even happens where the offender is grooming the parent. So it may even be that, they're even talking with the parent online. We've had that happen too. They can manipulate their voices. They can manipulate their messaging. With the child, it happens very insidiously. It's like very small little things, as Mr. Clark talked about, where they start talking about the same likes, that they like hockey and that they like certain games, and they are, watching each other playing the games, and then they'll start asking to send pictures, and it just keeps building and building to a place where suddenly the child has revealed their location, their school information, their age. They've sent photos, and none of that can be taken back. And if a child is feeling that they'll get in trouble from their parents or caregivers, they're not about to share that information even with their friends or siblings or their parents.
Thank you very much.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention Carol Todd. She's an educator in School District 43, and that's in my riding of Port Moody Coquitlam. Her daughter, at the age of 14, in 2012, committed suicide. Her daughter had been being groomed by a friend, an anonymous friend in the Netherlands at the time, Amanda Todd was her name. And Carol has been a great advocate around tabling legislation. Perhaps my first question is for Dr. Poison-Holman. And it's really around, I guess, the fact that our government tried to bring forward legislation around mitigating the risk of exposure to harmful content, and that includes content that victimizes children. And I know that legislation died in January this year, and then Parliament was prorogued. But I'd like to hear from you, Doctor, what within that Online Harms Act, Bill C-63, what in there do you feel should come back in its original form, or what might need to be changed or strengthened?
Thank you for the question. I fully am in support of the Online Harms Act or something similar that's needed to ensure the protection of our children and our teens. I think that there's a few key areas. One is that we need to ensure that whatever we put forward, that there's limited sexual child exploitation that is happening, and there needs to be deterrence. There needs to be areas that anyone who's producing the material, who's using the material, needs to have some kind of deterrence that's associated with those things. Currently, it's very unclear, and it's not consistent across provinces and across judgments. I would say the second is that there's regulation that's needed for schools and for other community activities. It's very difficult for educators to take this on their own. Oftentimes, as I mentioned, the platforms are changing. The information needs to be shared with parents and caregivers as well on an ongoing basis, and it needs to be updated. And then the third piece is that at a community level, there needs to be updates and supports for programs such as, Little Warriors Prevent It program or other organizations who are doing similar programming, so that parents and educators, as well as children and teens, have the right information so that they can continue to have conversation about this. Just limiting things and putting laws onto these areas is not enough. We have to continue to have the conversations because things are constantly changing and being updated as well.
I know that for Carol Todd, and given that her daughter would be 15 would have had her birthday, in 3 days' time, I know that she was very upset that this legislation kind of died. So certainly take your comments into consideration when hopefully bringing it back.
For being here and for asking such good questions. Thank you to Mr. Clark and to Dr. Poulsen-Holman for being here as well. We very much appreciate the information that you have shared with us today, and it will be very helpful in the study that we do, and then, of course, in the report that will be drafted and recommendations that will be made to the government.